The victory over Nazi Germany in May 1945 and the subsequent trials of Nazi criminals revealed to the world the true and absolute evil that had been formalized by the Third Reich as an ideological doctrine and elaborated in a series of documents. In this film, we will attempt to reconstruct the fundamental principles of Nazism and the different stages of its origin, evolution, as well as its deserved and shameful collapse. Adolf Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, became a true symbol of faith for all Nazi supporters. Written between 1923 and 1927, this work gained popularity among Germans even before Hitler came to power. Given the severe economic, social, and psychological crisis at the time, ideas about the national exclusivity of Germans and even their racial superiority over all other people, granting them the right to world domination, began to resonate on the pages of Mein Kampf. This same book declared the Jews an inferior race and subhumans who, in Hitler's view, were the main enemies of the German people and the primary culprits for Germany's defeat in World War I. Hitler claimed that if 12,000 or 15,000 Jews had been gassed in the run-up to the war, there never would have been millions of casualties on the battlefront. There were also other enemies and historical mistakes that the future Führer proposed to correct. For example, he demanded the return of German Austria to its great German homeland as one of the points of unification for all ethnic Germans. He also called for a decisive and final confrontation between Germany and France, arguing that the long-standing conflict between the two countries should be resolved by switching from defense to attack. In general, Hitler saw war as the only way for Germans to establish their own living space. But overall, Germany planned to acquire new territories in Europe at the expense of Russia and its neighboring states. In the 1930s, the ideas of Mein Kampf were disseminated in all schools and universities, among the Hitler Youth, the SA, the SS, and to the entire German population. Through Alfred Rosenberg's office, it was even offered as a wedding gift to newlywed. Alfred Rosenberg was a loyal comrade to Hitler and a prominent Nazi ideologist. Having joined the National Socialist Party a few months before Hitler, he had already formulated the ideas he would later present to the future Führer. These ideas were set forth in The Myth of the 20th Century, his second most important work after Mein Kampf. In it, Rosenberg effectively attempted to create a new religion that was anti-Christian and pagan in its essence. Judging by Rosenberg's earlier work, the nature, principles, and aims of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, written in 1922, he expected the dissemination of these ideas throughout the world in a manner that was far from peaceful. National Socialism believes that one day the great world struggle will end, the current era will be defeated, and the time will come when the swastika will flutter on the various flags of the Germanic people as an Aryan symbol of rebirth. In 1932, Rosenberg outlined the direction of Nazi aggression. The awareness that the German nation, in order not to perish in the full sense of the word, needs living space for future generations as much as it needs today, and the solid understanding that this territory can no longer be conquered in Africa, but only in Europe, and above all in the East. All these concepts must fundamentally determine German foreign policy for centuries to come. Like Hitler, Rosenberg supported militant anti-Semitism. In March 1941, during the inauguration of the Institute for Research on the Jewish Question, he made the following statement. For Germany, the Jewish question will only be solved when the last Jew has left the greater German space. And for Europe, it will not be solved until the last Jew has left the European continent. Thus, the basic lines of Nazi ideology were formulated, which later formed the basis of the political and legal system and the military doctrine of the Third Reich. The persecution of Jews escalated rapidly. Jews were systematically deprived of their property and excluded from the country's economic life. Jewish businesses and enterprises were transferred to Aryan ownership. As early as 1935, the so-called Nuremberg race laws were enacted, actively depriving Jews of German citizenship and consequently the right to vote and the ability to hold public office. The term Mischling emerged, denoting a mixture of German and Jewish blood. A first-degree Mischling had 2 Aryans and 2 Jews among their 4 ancestors. A second-degree Mischling was purer and had 3 Aryans and 1 Jew. Second-degree Mischlings could only marry Aryans and thus integrate into the German populace. Things became increasingly difficult for the Jewish population in Germany after the incident of November 7, 1938. The Polish Jew Herschel Grinspan assassinated Ernst von Rath, secretary of the German embassy in Paris. On the night of November 9, 1938, mass pogroms against Jews swept through Germany. This event became known in history as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. The pogromists burned and destroyed 815 shops and commercial establishments, as well as 267 synagogues. A total of 36 people were killed and 20,000 were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The Jews suffered total damages of 25 million Reichsmarks, but they, the injured party, were forced to pay 12.5 million Reichsmarks in compensation for the pogroms. The surviving lightning telegrams from SS Gruppenführer Heydrich, dated November 10, 1938, indicate that this action was entirely perpetuated by the authorities. Until summer 1941, the Nazis had been considering a plan to resettle Jews on the island of Madagascar. But with the start of the war against the USSR, the German government's plans changed. In January 1942, at a secret meeting in Groß-Wannsee, the fate of 11 million Jews living in Europe was decided. The final solution meant their deportation to the east and their mass extermination in special concentration camps. The center of the death industry was Auschwitz, which housed up to 100,000 prisoners. Up to 12,000 people were killed daily in the camp's gas chambers. Another horrific chapter of the Holocaust was the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto. It was established in November 1940 and housed 400,000 Jews. Of these, 316,000 were sent to death camps. In spring 1943, the ghetto and its remaining inhabitants were exterminated by the Nazis. Poland itself was also unlucky. It became a kind of testing ground for the Nazis to evaluate their plans for the assimilation of the living space they had captured. The 4 western provinces of Poland were effectively incorporated into Germany. The remaining part formed the General Government of Poland. The Nazis planned to utilize all their resources of the Polish General Government to strengthen Germany's military and political position. According to the diary of Polish Governor-General Hans Frank, he received instructions to suck everything out of there. The Germanization of this part of Poland, which was part of the German Empire, entailed deportation of Jews, intellectuals, and other elements who opposed the Nazis to the territory of the General Government, deportation of the healthy and able-bodied Polish population to Germany as labor force, transformation of all Poles with a minimum of German blood into German subjects, imbued with Nazi ideals through a system of racial registration. Those who refused to register would be sent to concentration camps. The resettlement of thousands of German citizens into the newly annexed Polish lands, for whom the property of Jews, Poles, and those dissatisfied with the Nazis, especially in rural areas, was confiscated. The diary of Polish Governor General and the Reich Minister Hans Frank leaves no doubt that a similar fate awaited other peoples of Eastern Europe. Entire nations, together with their culture, language, and traditions, were to be wiped from the face of the earth. Racial distinctions did not favor the Nordic peoples. They were subjected to complete Germanization. Peoples not classified by Hitler as belonging to the Nordic race, Italians, French, and Greeks, were subjected to biological weakening through famine, deportations, and terror. However, the most terrible fate was reserved for the population of the USSR and the Russian people, who, according to the General Plan Ost, would face mass deportations beyond the Urals and physical extermination. As early as 1939, dreaming of victory over the USSR, Hitler declared that the extermination of the Jews was only an experiment compared to the scale of the impending destruction of the Slavs. Hitler's Germany began preparing for an attack on the Soviet Union in July 1941, immediately after the conclusion of military operations in France. Troops were redeployed to Poland, and from September 1940, the formation of 40 new infantry and tank divisions for the war in the East began in Leipzig. In early December 1940, Directive Number 21 was issued by the German General Staff under the codename Fritz. On December 18, 1940, it was approved under the codename Barbarossa. The directive itself contained the technical and military provisions of a strategic plan to attack the USSR, which stipulated that Nazi troops would reach the Arkhangelsk-Astrakhan line in winter 1941. Numerous documents generated by this directive paint a picture of the fate that Hitler's regime had in store for the peoples of the USSR. As early as March 1941, the task of dividing the territory of Russia into several states with their own governments was defined. Our task is to organize socialist state entities that will depend on us as quickly as possible and with minimum of military force. According to numerous documents of the Nazi command, Great Russia was to be weakened as much as possible, including through the transfer of significant territories to the jurisdiction of newly formed administrative units, especially Belarus, Ukraine, and the Don region. The territories of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Belarus were to be unified into a separate administrative territorial unit, which, thanks to the Germanization of racially suitable elements, through colonization by the German people and the deportation of undesirable elements, would become part of the Greater German Reich. Ukraine was to be encouraged in every possible way in its aspirations for national independence, including the potential creation of its own state, either in Ukraine itself or in unification with the Don region and the Caucasus. This unification would constitute a Black Sea Union, which would constantly threaten Moscow and protect the German Greater Lebensraum from the east. Economically, this region would simultaneously represent a powerful raw material and food base for the Greater German Empire. Part of the Kursk and Voronezh regions would be added to this territory. The fate of Ukraine was also specified in Rosenberg's instruction of May 7, 1941, to create a free Ukrainian state up to Saratov. The future of the Crimean Peninsula, which was to be incorporated into the Third Reich, was specifically stipulated. The occupation regime established in the occupied territories of the USSR was incredibly harsh. According to the order of the Chief of Staff of the Wehrmacht High Command, Keitel, on military jurisdiction in the Barbarossa area and special powers of the troops of May 13, 1941. Attacks by hostile civilians against the armed forces its members and service personnel were to be suppressed by the troops on the spot, using the most extreme measures to eliminate the aggressor. With regard to populated areas where the armed forces have been subjected to a treacherous or insidious attack, it was proposed to immediately use large-scale violent measures if circumstances do not allow for the rapid identification of specific culprits. It was also stipulated that punishment for acts committed by military personnel and members of the security forces against hostile civilians is not mandatory, even in cases where these actions simultaneously constitute a military crime or an offense. Such cruelty was justified by the fact that Germany's defeat in 1918, the subsequent period of suffering for the German people, as well as the struggle against National Socialism, which demanded numerous bloody sacrifices, were the result of Bolshevik influence, which no German has forgotten. Among the settlements subject to mass violent measures if circumstances do not allow for the rapid identification of specific perpetrators was Hatyn, a Belarusian village burned on March 22, 1943, in retaliation for the killing of several German soldiers by local partisans. Local residents were herded into a barn and set on fire. A total of 149 people, 75 of them children, were burned alive. The Russian Hatyn is the name given to the Большое Заречье in the Leningrad region. On October 30, 1943, a German punitive detachment broke into the village and set fire to all the houses. Several residents were shot, and the rest were herded into a house in the neighboring village of Glumitsy and burned alive. In total, 66 people died that day, including 19 children. Tronovka, a village in the Zhukovsky district of the Bryansk region, was completely burned down by the German occupiers on May 20, 1943, for helping partisans. 243 people died. The village of Krasucha in the Leningrad region was destroyed by punitive forces from Estonia, who broke in and began setting fire to houses one after another. Residents who tried to save their property and animals were beaten with rifle butts and bayoneted. Everyone was herded into 2 threshing barns on the outskirts of the village. The doors of the barns were boarded shut and the wooden structures were doused with gasoline and set on fire. Those who tried to escape the flames were shot with automatic weapons. About 280 people died this way. Their names have not been fully identified, since the dead included small children and refugees from Leningrad and Staraya Russa. There were hundreds of villages and hamlets brutally attacked like this in the occupied territory of the USSR. Keitel's decree was corroborated by a decree issued by Rosenberg, the Reich Minister for the occupied Eastern Territories, on the punishment of the population that disobeyed the occupying authorities, which provided for the death penalty or forced labor for anyone who demonstrated the slightest resistance to the occupying authorities. The story of the death of Viktor Cherevichkin, a teenager from Rostov-on-Don, became widely and tragically known. He hid his dovecote after the Nazis ordered the destruction of pigeons in the area surrounding the city. The boy was found murdered holding a pigeon. His posthumous photograph, taken by Soviet photojournalist Max Alpert, was used at the Nuremberg trials as part of the photographic documentation incriminating Nazis with crimes against humanity. A certain and painful death awaited all children and adolescents suspected of resisting the occupying authorities and helping the partisans. Various directives and documents of the Nazi command provided specific details about the fight against partisans in the occupied territories. Not only the partisans themselves, but also all categories of the population that supported the insurgents were subject to punishment by hanging or execution. Among the prescribed punishments, the deportation of men fit for forced labor to Germany, and by any means without restriction, even against women and children, since this struggle has nothing in common with the chivalrous conduct of a soldier or with the rules of the Geneva Convention. In In January 1943, the order of Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler on the deportation to camps of the Soviet population suspected of supporting partisans was issued. All men, women and children suspected of having connections with bandits were to be sent to the camps of Lublin or Auschwitz. In Lublin, collective camps were to be set up for children and adolescents for the education of racially complete male and female adolescents. The population of the occupied territories, even those with no history of resistance to the Nazis, were still ordered to instill fear, which in itself could discourage the population from resisting. As the war in the East was seen as a struggle between Europe and Asia, between the German Reich and subhumans, the population of the USSR was considered a future source of slavery. In the Soviet territory captured by the Germans, there is literally not a single city, a single village, a single populated area from which the Nazi bandits have not enslaved a significant portion of the population, reaching in some large cities tens of thousands of men, women, adolescents, and children. In the village of Soldatskoye, Voronezh region, the Nazis gathered 11,000 people from occupied villages, including many women, adolescents, and children. For several days, the unfortunate ones huddled in barns and underground shelters. The German authorities let them starve and did not allow them to go anywhere, and then took them to Germany. Numerous documents from the Nuremberg trials describe the terrible fate of the population of the Soviet Union taken into slavery. Philip Botsman, who lost his health in forced labor in Germany and returned home, reported. The village of Mironovka was supposed to provide 20 young people, men and women, to be sent to Germany. They grabbed young people on the streets, pulled them from their beds at night. Along with others, I ended up in Berlin. Hundreds of people were herded into a cold shed, surrounded by a high fence. We slept on a stone floor. The German foremen and guards were very suspicious and demanding towards Russians. At the slightest provocation, they would assault me and curse. Hunger and hard work ruined my health. Nadia, a 16-year-old 9th grade student of a secondary school in the Voroshilovgrad region, recalled. The Germans forcibly sent almost all of our young people to forced labor in Germany. Myself and 16 other girls were sent to the city of Schwarz. There was a real trade in Russians there. German men and women turned us this way and that, and they measured and felt us. Every day I cleaned the floor, washed laundry, morning and night, looked after the children, dressed them. I fell ill from the exhausting work, hunger, and beatings. After recovering a little, I fled to my homeland. In Brest-Litovsk, I was detained and sent to a concentration camp. In that camp, thousands of Soviet citizens were wasting away in dilapidated barns. Every day, 10 to 15 corpses were taken out of the camp. To prevent the growth of what the Nazis considered an inferior population in the occupied territories, abortions and the distribution of contraceptives were planned. It was also stipulated not to introduce German services for the local population of the occupied Eastern territories. For example, under no circumstances should vaccinations or other health improvement measures be carried out to the non-German population. Under no circumstances should the local population receive higher education, the Nazi document stated. Thus, the goal of the Hitlerite regime in the USSR was to govern the conquered territory and exploit the country. Rosenberg stated that securing food supplies for the German people during these years will, without a doubt, be the most important German demand in the East. The southern regions and the North Caucasus will have to provide food reserves for the German people. We are not committed to feeding the Russian people with products from these regions. We know that this is a pressing necessity that transcends any sentimentality. Without a doubt, a large-scale evacuation will be necessary, and very difficult years lie ahead for the Russians. In this regard, the instruction of the State Secretary of the Reich Ministry of Food and Agriculture, Herbert Bakke, on the rules of conduct for officials in the territory of the USSR intended for occupation, dated June 1st, 1941, is interesting. Considering that the newly annexed territories must be permanently secured for Germany and Europe, much will depend on how you position yourselves there. You must, with a sense of dignity, carry out the harshest and most merciless measures. The number of such measures in the occupied territory of the USSR exceeds tens of thousands. One example is the execution of tens of thousands of Soviet civilians and prisoners of war in 1941 to 1943 at Babi Yar on the outskirts of Kiev. The exact number of victims remains an enigma for historians to this day. According to available documents of the Extraordinary State Commission and expert estimates, up to 150,000 people were exterminated in this ravine by autumn 1943, when the Red Army liberated Kiev. Jews, communists, prisoners of war of various nationalities, gypsies, psychiatric patients, the disabled, children, women, the elderly, and Orthodox priests. Some historians believe the death toll is as high as 200,000. An exact number is unlikely, since the Nazis exhumed and destroyed tens of thousands of remains of murdered Soviet citizens in furnaces before their withdrawal from Kiev in 1943. In August 1942, in Zmeyovskaya Balka, near Rostov-on-Don, the German occupiers shot and killed approximately 27,000 people. Among the dead were about 15,000 Jews. Only after the crushing defeat at Stalingrad on February 2, 1943, did the Nazi rhetoric regarding the peoples of the USSR fundamentally change. We cannot call these people, who represent the peoples of the East, who hope that we will bring them liberation, beasts and barbarians, and expect them to be interested in Germany's victory. Statements that Germany will create colonies in the East and pursue a colonial policy that views the country and its population as an object of exploitation are completely inappropriate. Moreover, the question of deporting the native population cannot be discussed. Another flagrant crime of Nazism against Soviet citizens was the removal of the status of Soviet prisoners of war from the framework of the international legal system. For the first time, the German soldier encounters an enemy trained not only in military terms. With this, the Bolshevik soldier has lost all claim to be treated as an honorable soldier in accordance with the provisions of the Geneva Convention. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war in the Nazi camps was particularly inhumane. The Nuremberg trials contain documents describing the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war in the Lambsdorff camp or Stalag 344. These documents show that, unlike prisoners of war of other nationalities, Polish, British, French, Belgian, and Greek prisoners of war who were held in the camp from 1940 to 1945, Soviet citizens were the only ones who were denied any outdoor walks. The fact that Soviet prisoners of war were kept in worse conditions than those from other countries is also evidenced by this document. The need to replace 104 British prisoners of war working as part of prisoner of war labour unit number E351 at the Heinrichsthal paper mill with 160 Soviet prisoners of war is due to the increased need for labour at this mill. Replenishing the unit with British prisoners of war up to the required number of 160 people is impossible, given that, after an inspection of the camp by the competent military authorities in recent months, it was found that the existing facilities are sufficient for only 104 British prisoners of war. However, 160 Russian prisoners of war can easily be accommodated in the same facilities. It is also known that Soviet prisoners of war were subjected to inhumane medical experiments within the camp facilities. Of the 14,033 camps that made up the Nazi system, where prisoners perished, not only in gas chambers and crematoria, but also from hunger, disease, beatings, torture, forced labor, and medical experiments on humans. Auschwitz is the most well known. People from all over Europe were brought there. The extent of the Nazi cynicism towards prisoners is difficult to describe. According to the testimony of Marie-Claude Vaillant-Courtellier, a participant in the French resistance and a prisoner of Auschwitz from January 1943, the arriving trains were greeted by an orchestra of young and beautiful female prisoners. The orchestra members played arias from the operetta The Merry Widow and the barcarolle from the Tales of Hoffmann. There were cases of people who came to Auschwitz voluntarily, without knowing what awaited them. For example, the Jews of Thessaloniki received postcards and prepared text, which they were to copy by hand. "We are well settled, we have work, we are well treated and well fed. We await your arrival." Vaillant-Courtellier reported that in Greece and Slovakia, entire families showed up at the recruiting office to be reunited with their loved ones. Millions of people brought from various countries to the Auschwitz concentration camp were subjected to organized robbery within the first hour of their arrival. All their belongings, suitcases, clothes, bedding, even underwear and shoes, were confiscated by the SS and sent to Germany. People fit for work who remained to perform forced labor were given striped prisoner clothing instead of their belongings. The Auschwitz camp had 35 special warehouses for sorting and packing belongings and clothing, 29 of which the Germans burned along with their contents before retreating under pressure from the Red Army. German doctors played a key role in the so-called selections. Children under 12 or 14 years old, the elderly over 50, the sick, and people with criminal records were sent directly to the gas chambers. The others were examined by an SS doctor. Those deemed unfit for work were also condemned to death. Special baths, gas chambers for killing people, were built in 5 crematoria. In addition, the camp had 2 separate baths, whose corpses were cremated on special pyres. Before cremation, dentists removed gold teeth and crowns from the corpses. From 1943 onwards, the Germans, intending to use uncremated bones for industrial purposes, began to grind them up and sell them to the company Strom for processing into superphosphate. Documents were found in the camp regarding the shipment of 112 tons and 600 kilograms of bone fragments from human corpses to Strom. The Germans also used hair cut from women destined for extermination for industrial purposes. The camp contributed approximately 2 million marks to the treasury annually. In the Auschwitz camp, Nazi doctors and professors conducted extensive medical experiments on living people. Block 10 housed up to 400 female prisoners at a time and subjected them to sterilization experiments and other brutal experiments aimed at degrading their reproductive functions and reducing the birth rate among the inferior races. In Block 21, mass experiments were conducted on men for the same purpose. In Block 28, prisoners were subjected to artificial skin lesions using kerosene, various salts, pastes, and powders. Quinacrine was also used there to study artificially induced jaundice. By order of the German chief physician Friedrich Entress, from 1941 to 1944, prisoners were killed in the camp hospitals by injecting phenol into their heart. Over the existence of the Auschwitz camp, the German executioners murdered at least 4 million citizens of the USSR, Poland, France, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, the Netherlands, Belgium, and other countries. It is known that in the occupied territory of the USSR, brutal medical experiments were conducted on prisoners in at least 3 of the 10 camps, Vivere and its affiliates, Kaiserwald, and Salaspils. Many modern historians argue that all places of forced detention created by the Nazis need to be taken into account. For example, the above list does not include the camp in Gatchina Dulag 154, where more than 80,000 people, both civilians and prisoners of war, were murdered from 1941 to 1944. This is actually comparable to the death toll of the world-famous Ravensbrück camp, where 92,000 people were killed and murdered. Approximately 25,000 people died in the Stalino-Donetsk transit camp for prisoners of war between 1941 and 1943. This would raise the number of facilities associated with the Nazi camp system to 44,500, and the number of victims would increase correspondingly. The total number of victims in the 10 largest camps is at least 225,000 prisoners. The last statement is clearly reaffirmed by the history of the extermination of Soviet citizens near the villages of Zhistynaya Gorka and Chornaya in the Novgorod region, where from 1941 to 1943, the Nazis deported prisoners of war, partisans and civilians from the districts of Novgorod, Oredesh, Batetsky, Luzhsky and Gachinsky, that is to say from the territories of the present-day Leningrad, Novgorod and Pskov regions. In December 1944, report number 582 of the Extraordinary State Commission for the Establishment and Investigation of the Atrocities of the Nazi Invaders recorded 3,700 victims. However, in 2019, thanks to the efforts of the Delina search team, another burial site was discovered, increasing the death toll by 500. On October 27, 2020, the Solovetsky District Court of the Novgorod region recognized the murder of civilians near Zhistynaya Gorka as an act of genocide. Since then, 32 other similar sentences have been issued in regions of the Russian Federation that were part of the occupation zone during World War II. Also in the Novgorod region, in autumn 1941, a prisoner of war camp was established at a former hay station in the town of Demyansk, where 13,000 people were kept in open air for several months. Subsequently, they were housed in dugouts, each with capacity of 70 to 80 people. In these conditions, there was nowhere to lie down, nor even to sit, and therefore the majority of prisoners were forced to sleep standing up, according to published documents. The camp prisoners were forced to perform strenuous labor for 12 hours daily, including road construction and timber extraction. They went without food for several days, and were then taken in small groups to fields to harvest potatoes, which they were forced to eat raw, skins and all. The Nazis killed prisoners for any reason, including for leaving the dugouts to relieve themselves. By May 1942, of the 13,000 prisoners held in the camp, only about 700 had survived. Terrible crimes against humanity were committed in a prisoner of war camp in the village of Alexeyevka in the Gorodishinsky district of the Stalingrad region. There, up to 1,500 soldiers and commanders of the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army were found brutally tortured. An examination of the bodies revealed that the majority had smashed skulls, open abdomens, and severed heads, legs, and arms. Many bodies were burned with charred heels. 2 bodies were nailed to the ground with stakes. one of them had 2 iron spoons stuck in their mouth, noted the reports compiled by the officers. A military doctor from the unit that occupied Alexeyevka stated that the prisoners were pushed to the point of exhaustion and had their heads crushed with rifle butts by the Nazis. The bodies were then dragged into trenches and bunkers. The Nazi crimes against children were truly horrific. For example, in the Salaspils camp from 1941 to 1944, approximately 7,000 children died as a result of blood collection for German soldiers and officers. A photograph taken by war correspondent Galina Sanko in the liberated Soviet city of Petrozavodsk in June 1944 became widely known. It depicts a group of children near barbed wire with a sign above them that read, "Entry, exit, and the conservation through the barbed wire are prohibited under penalty of death." The photograph became widely known, a symbol of concentration camp prisoners, and was presented as evidence at the Nuremberg war crimes trials. The children were kept in terrible conditions, like all prisoners in 17 camps in Karelia and 6 camps in Petrozavodsk, where the mortality rate was even higher than in German camps, 10%, and in the Finnish camps, 13.75%. Forced blood collection was common practice. Violence and abuse against prisoners were frequent. For example, prisoners were placed in tanks of cold water for the slightest offense. The Finnish doctor Kolemainen often tortured people instead of treating them. A report of August 15, 1944, on the atrocities of the Nazi scoundrels in the district center of Domačeva, Brest region, details the murder of children from an orphanage by the Nazis. The document contains a list with the names of 100 children raised in the orphanage. 54 children were shot immediately. 15 were sent to the ghetto and killed there. 27 were rescued by local residents. 3 died in the first day of the war, and the fate of 1 more child is unknown. On October 9th and 10th, 1942, 214 children from an orphanage evacuated from Simferopol to Yeysk were murdered. Unfortunately, this horrific list could continue indefinitely. The total number of civilian victims in the USSR during the German occupation was approximately 14 million, with about 2 million people dying in exile during forced labor. The routine methods of terror, beatings of prisoners, solitary confinement, and executions for sabotage and escape attempts were identical to those used in all Nazi concentration camps. In 1943 to 1944, concentration camps played a key role in the extermination of Soviet citizens. In addition to mass executions of prisoners in the area of the Krasny State Farm concentration camp, Salaspils, Mali Trostenets, Koldicheva, and the Syretsky camp, so-called gas vans were used, making these camps similar to those in Poland and Germany, which used permanent gas chambers. Thus, Nazism revealed its terrifying face in the territory and in relation to the citizens of all countries that confronted it. Among them were countries that had pursued a policy of appeasement until 1939. However, it was the population of the USSR that suffered the greatest losses in the confrontation with the Third Reich.